Hi, I'm going to summarize the article Flying with Louis by Dr. Joanne Cardinal-Schubert from Making a Noise, Aboriginal Perspectives on Art, Art History, Critical Writing, and Community. Before we get into the summary of the article, it is worth unpacking Cardinal-Schubert's first line of the text. In his essay titled Terribly Beautiful, Joanne Cardinal-Schubert's Intervention of Passion, Garneau explains that this formal welcome is a non-colonial protocol rather than an anti-colonial strategy. He writes that it does not confront colonialism, but does an end run around it to link one Indigenous person, the author, to another, the reader, in an Indigenous space. He explains that in most texts, even those authored by Indigenous people, there is typically a more general reader, in other words, a settler. He writes that by indigenizing the space of reading, Cardinal-Schubert produces an alienation empathy response in the settler reader, while also providing Indigenous minds a singular, yet collective Indigenous reading conscientiousness, rather than the double conscientiousness that settler texts usually impose. So he says that by addressing readers as we and us, Cardinal-Schubert leads us into community or alliance. Cardinal-Schubert appoints Louis Diel as piloting this final international voyage of the Aboriginal Concord in her metaphor because he is an important historical figure who understood the need for Indigenous people to wake up and claim what is theirs by birthright and for Indigenous artists to awaken their ancestral spirits back. In her article, she explains that she chose Louis Diel because he was far-seeing and his vision stretched over 100 years into the future, to where we essentially find ourselves now. Why a concord? The metaphor of a concord alludes to the fact that it holds a lot of people and thus a lot of people can contribute. A concord is fast and brings its travelers quickly to their destination. When reading the article, we understand that Indigenous people have been placed in an imposed holding pattern, barely visible to others on the global radar, without runways and land bases formerly familiar in our journey through history. This reminds us readers of everything that colonialism has tried to separate from Indigenous people, including lands, culture, and family ties. In her metaphor of the last voyage of the Aboriginal Concord, Cardinal-Schubert explains that someone had to do it. She doesn't want anyone to forget that Aboriginal artists have been heroes in having the vision for an intervention to push for equality. There is a sense of urgency for this plane to land imminently, and that the Indigenous artists aboard the flight have a powerful influence in the way it lands. This last trip is sort of like a last chance. Cardinal-Schubert explains in her article that she believes it is Indigenous people's last chance to take this trip aboard this metaphorical Concorde. This is a turning point in a position of taking a stand. All the pieces of the puzzle are in place, such as funding for varying Aboriginal art. Indigenous self-determination is a right that many non-Indigenous people have taken for granted, and it is important that at this time, Indigenous artists take action to propel this self-determination forward and redefine and reshape their future. Who is aboard this Concorde? As the text continues on with the metaphor, readers find out who is aboard the plane. Sitting in first class, sipping on Saskatoon berry juice and nibbling on bannock are the Indigenous artists. Closely behind them are the directors, administrators, curators, historians, and critics. And finally, toward the back of the plane, we find potential Aboriginal art viewers and patrons asleep. I interpret this as meaning the Aboriginal artists have the most influence in the direction this Concorde is going. They have the most impact in taking a stand to fix things. They have the most power in reawakening spirits back into this land. From pages 30 all the way through 35 of her article, Cardinal-Schubert refers to multiple Indigenous artists as positive contributors to the imminent landing of this metaphorical Aboriginal Concorde. Many of these real-life artists that I've listed on this PowerPoint slide enter into Cardinal-Schubert's fictitious narration within the metaphor. They're depicted conversing, laughing, telling jokes, sleeping, playing solitaire, or their names are mentioned because they have their artwork displayed aboard the Concorde. For example, Cardinal-Schubert, the author of this article, places herself in the Concorde too, where she attempts to stand up and say something about global tourism exotica and trade initiatives, but her voice fades as the conversations around her become louder. There are many fictional conversations happening aboard this metaphorical Concorde on multiple topics. Two recurring topics that I noticed are of recognition and of art. For example, in regards to recognition, we read Alex Janvier saying, "I am the first abstract painter and I feel that my work has never been recognized as such." This is the second wave of artists. We read that Bill Reed admits that he is left out again. We see that Norval Morisot says, "They took me to Europe and put me in big hotels and I painted the whole time. They gave me everything I wanted. Then they took my paintings. When I asked them where my pay was, they said, 'You've had your pay. The limos, the air travel, the hotel, your habits. That was your pay. You've been paid.'" A quote on a wall panel of an abstract image by Everett Soup reads, "My paintings were in the era of abstract expressionism. They were color patterns, the colors of the natural world. I studied at the Banff Center for the Arts and at Brigham Young University. To my people, I was not an Indian artist. Neither was I considered an Indian artist by others." So we see those conversations happening on recognition aboard the Concorde. And then we also have multiple conversations about art. Here are a few of them. There really is so much subtle nuance to all of these brief fictional conversations that the passengers are having aboard the plane. We realize that Cardinal-Schubert is truly in the know of this Indigenous art world. As a reader, I feel included in the sense that I get a glimpse into this world, and yet I feel a little bit left out because there's so much meaning I'm missing by not knowing more about all of these artists, events, societies that she mentions, and associations she refers to in her metaphor. Mission accomplished. The mission seems to be in the process of being accomplished because as the metaphorical Concorde prepares for landing, we read about two children wanting to become artists after witnessing what has been happening aboard the plane. To me, this signifies success in the sense that those Indigenous artists aboard the metaphorical Concorde are inspiring and affecting the subsequent generation to propel this movement forward. The fictional Louis Diel in the article says assuredly, "Final landing anticipated. Mission accomplished. All passengers are awakening, noisy, with spirits intact, and we are almost ready to land. We await further instructions." Cardinal-Schubert sums up her metaphor, acknowledging that Aboriginal artists are the first liners in this movement and are carrying the voices of ancestors forward. Making a noise. It seems as though this article was written by Joanne Cardinal-Schubert as her keynote speech for the conference Making a Noise, Aboriginal Perspectives on Art, Art History, Critical Writing, and Community. She is inspiring the Indigenous community to wholeheartedly participate in this awakening. In this metaphorical landing of taking back what is theirs, this means to create and use Indigenous language of art, not merely imitating a European Western art theory. A few pages later in her article, Cardinal-Schubert relates her metaphor to this very symposium. She writes that Louis Diel was correct in his 100-year-old visionary statement that his people would sleep for this amount of time before they awoke, and the artist gave them their spirits back. The symposium and resulting publication, Making a Noise, is perhaps a continued awakening. Within this article, we learn more about Cardinal-Schubert through some of her descriptions of her contributions. She worked professionally as a curator for many years. We learn that she became a full-time artist in 1985. In her article, she mentions that she curated and produced a catalog, Art is Our Game. She volunteered with the Calgary Aboriginal Arts Awareness Society since 1988. She helped create Canada's 5th Aboriginal Run Gallery in 2001. We can see through her intentional actions that she is an influential contributor in landing this metaphorical Concorde well. In the article, there are other real-life examples of Aboriginal Concorde metaphor in action. These are real-life examples that she gives us of heroes in the Indigenous community paving the way to change the system. For example, there was a group of individual artists and creators in the late 1980s whom Margot Kane brought together in Vancouver, and they had a vision that it was time to do something. We see also in her article that there was a meeting held in Edmonton, which included professional actors, writers, theater directors, performers, video and filmmakers who agreed to remove themselves from designated roles such as token Indians or on non-Aboriginal professional theater, publishing, film, and video incentives. Subsequently, they agreed to form their own organization, realizing that only they could change the situation. There are a few more examples in the article. For example, in 1988, Edward Poitras and Joanne Cardinal-Schubert were the first Aboriginal artists to occupy Layton Colony Studios through the initiative of Anishinaabe artist Tom Barnes. In the late 1990s, the Coalition for the Advancement of Aboriginal Studies organized a week event with the Glen Bow Museum entitled Through Elders' Eyes, where elders were chosen from 4 points in Alberta, serving as museum interpreters and curator experts. The elders advised the museum professionals regarding protocol of properly understanding these cultural objects. Because of their influence, some objects were removed to separate areas where an elder had to be present when they were accessed. These are only some of the many examples of the initiatives and investments made by individuals to change the system, and quoted in her article, from her article. In her article, we learned that there are still many obstacles left to overcome now that the metaphorical plane is landing. For example, there has been a fragmented sharing, which has contributed to the commodification of Aboriginal culture as exotica. There needs to be more programs to encourage and provide financial support for career development in the arts, where Aboriginal galleries, museums, and universities will be the new normal, staffed by Aboriginal people. And we also read that people are asleep when it comes to the arts. Communities should have access to a historical understanding of the development of Aboriginal art. Toward the end of the article, Cardinal-Schubert comes full circle by reflecting on Nuidiel's epiphany, to which she referred to at the beginning of her article, the epiphany on which her metaphor stands. She writes, "We could ask why Riel, educated as a priest and a lawyer, would be even reflecting about artists and their future contribution, and we may continue to ponder as to where his epiphany came from. Was the statement made in despair or with the confidence that there would be changes, and that we, in the positions as artists, curators, writers, and critics, would be equipped by now to carry out his prediction over 100 years later? Some continue to doze in a sleep-wake position. Some art writings are published, but it is not within the context of our own history. We collectively need to initiate that change by telling the story of ourselves." She writes this on page 42 of her article. Essentially, positive contributions and changes have been made, but there still needs to be a fundamental telling of the story by Indigenous people themselves. We find out toward the end of the article that aboard the metaphorical plane is Nuidiel's co-pilot, Pauline Johnson. Cardinal-Schubert writes that Pauline has been silent throughout this flight, studying the charts and maps and communicating with the control towers. Knowing that their flight is short and that they will be landing soon, Pauline Johnson spends the last hour reading her poetry to Nuidiel. One poem seems to be directly about him. It's called A Cry from an Indian Wife. Feel free to pause to read the poem yourself. About the poem, A Cry from an Indian Wife. After Pauline reads him her poem, Louis says he had heard about this poem in New York and that people were saying it was coded and that it seemed almost to be a written declaration of our pervasive historical strength. This historical strength is important in landing this metaphorical Concord well in the sense that it is continued forward. In conclusion, at the end of her article, Cardinal-Schubert sums it all up while simultaneously inspiring us. She writes, "Let making a noise be truly our own noise, not a bad imitation. Let our noise be a mix of ethics and life and values and beliefs and previous discoveries and realizations, perhaps the most important knowledge bank that we have available to access. Let us have big ideas about our future and tell our own stories. These are the items in our survival package, our spiritual art bundle, left to us that will carry us throughout life and that will allow both we and our children and then their children to transcend more obstacles and boundaries. They are our measurement, and we can surely depend on them. This is what we can leave to the next generation, the noise that we have always been here." I included Cardinal-Schubert's self-portrait in this slide to solidify her idea of self-representation. These are my references.